Welcome back once again, all of my low carb friends, and for those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. A little over a year ago, I put out a video on how to use coconut flour as a substitute for all-purpose flour. And since then, I have learned a few things that I think have made my coconut flour baked goods turn out even better, taste better, are fluffier, and just in general have a more taste and feel that is closer to your traditional baked goods. And so in this video, I'm going to give you a little bit of an update, and I'm also going to walk you through step by step how I convert a traditional baked good recipe into a coconut flour recipe. You can use this formula that I'm going to show you on pretty much any traditional baked good recipe to turn it into a coconut flour recipe. You can also use this formula on most almond flour baked good recipes for those of you who prefer coconut flour as opposed to almond flour. You can take that almond flour recipe and convert it to a coconut flour recipe using this formula. Now, as I always say in all of my informational videos, I am not an expert on anything. I am just sharing with you what has worked for me, and if it works for me, it will most likely work for you. We have a lot of good information to go over today, so let's get to it. So here I have a simple traditional drop cookie recipe that comes from a Better Homes and Garden recipe book that has been around since probably the 1980s. It is very old, but it's got a lot of good stuff in there. So we're going to be taking this drop cookie recipe and we are going to convert it to a coconut flour recipe. So when I am converting any baked good recipe to a coconut flour recipe, the first thing I do is look at how much flour is used in the recipe. In my other coconut flour substitute video, I said as a general rule, you use anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 the amount of coconut flour as you would all-purpose flour. Since then, what I have found has worked for me is just simply cutting the amount of flour in half. So in this case, in this particular recipe, it calls for 1 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour, which is generally around 150 grams of all-purpose flour. So I would cut that amount in half, which is about 1/2 cup plus 1/8 cup of flour. So instead of using 1 1/4 cups of coconut flour, I would use 1/2 cup plus 1/8 cup of coconut flour, which is around 70 to 75 grams of coconut flour. The next thing I look at is what type of leavening agent or rising agent do they use, if any, in the recipe. In this particular recipe, they use baking soda. In my experience, double-acting baking powder works better with coconut flour than baking soda. Coconut flour is very heavy, and so therefore it needs that double-acting power that baking powder has as opposed to baking soda. Baking soda only expands once. Double-acting baking powder expands twice. So coconut flour needs that extra oomph. And so I personally, in my experience, have better luck with baking powder than I do baking soda. However, baking powder is not a 1-to-1 ratio with baking soda. To substitute baking powder for baking soda, you need to use 3 times as much baking powder as baking soda. So this recipe calls for a 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. So I'm using baking powder, so I would multiply that by 3, which would make 1 1/2 teaspoons. So instead of that 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, I would use 1 1/2 teaspoons of baking powder. And a little side note here, if you are making a baked good other than cookies that need a more fluffy texture like cakes, cupcakes, muffins, breads, I automatically use 1 tablespoon of baking powder, no matter what the recipe says. That extra baking powder not only helps with the little bit of rising, coconut flour doesn't rise all that much, but it helps to get a little bit of rise out of coconut flour, and it also helps the texture of the cake or the bread to trap the gases of the baking powder in there and expand a little better, which makes your baked good a little bit more light and a little bit more fluffy. That's just a little side note that I do there. The next thing I do after I have converted the flour, converted the leavening agent, I look and see what other dry ingredients are there in the recipe. Are there any seasonings? Are there any spices? Are there any sweeteners? Anything else that is a dry, powdery type ingredient. In this recipe, the only other dry ingredients are the sugars. It calls for a 1/2 cup of granulated sugar and a 1/4 cup of brown sugar. This is easy. You don't have to make any changes in the sweeteners. All you need to do is substitute out the sugar for whatever sweetener of your choice. Like for me, I prefer monk fruit sweetener to other keto sweeteners. So instead of using the half cup of granulated sugar and the 4th cup of brown sugar, I would use a half cup of classic monk fruit sweetener and a 4th cup of golden monk fruit sweetener. But you would use whatever sweetener you want, and you would adjust it according to your taste. Anything that has to do with added flavoring, you adjust according to your taste. Same thing with salt, seasonings, extracts, any of that has to do with added flavor, you adjust according to your taste. I will say that for me, in any baked good recipe that contains salt, I don't use any more than a half teaspoon. No matter what the recipe says, I don't use any more than a half teaspoon of salt because I don't want my baked goods to taste like salt. And as far as seasonings and spices and extracts go, again, you adjust those according to your taste. But for me, what I usually do is I increase the amount of seasonings or spices by half or double. So if I had a recipe that called for 1 teaspoon of ground cinnamon, I would use anywhere from 1.5 teaspoons to 2 teaspoons of ground cinnamon in my coconut flour version of the recipe. The reason being that by increasing those seasonings and those spices just a little bit, it helps to counteract with any coconut flour taste that you might have in your baked good. Some people are really sensitive to that coconut taste in the coconut flour, but by increasing those spices and seasonings, it helps to balance out that coconut flour flavor so that when you have a savory bread or a savory recipe, it doesn't taste like savory coconut. After we've gotten all the dry ingredients converted and balanced the way we want it, the next thing I look at is eggs. Now, I know eggs are controversy to people. Some people eat eggs, some people don't eat eggs. In coconut flour baked goods, you have to use some kind of egg or egg substitute. Coconut flour is a gluten-free flour, which means it contains no binding agent. There is nothing in that flour that is going to help hold it together. So you have to add some type of binding agent to your gluten-free flour. Eggs are the best and the easiest binding agent when it comes to coconut flour because they not only bind your ingredients together, but they help add moisture. There are other binding ingredients out there that work well, but they absorb moisture rather than give moisture, which does not work well with coconut flour because coconut flour is very absorbent. And so if you want to find out more about some other binding agents that actually work well with coconut flour, you can check out my video and my article on my website on egg substitutes that work with coconut flour. But in this recipe, we are using eggs. I've said in my other coconut flour substitute video that as a general rule, for every 1 cup of coconut flour that you use, you need 6 eggs plus 1 cup of liquid. I don't really like that rule because I don't like my coconut flour baked goods to taste like eggs. If I am making a chocolate cake, I do not want it to taste like chocolate coconut eggs. If I am making a savory bread, I don't want it to taste like a savory omelet. So I try to use the bare minimum amount of eggs in my baked goods. So my general rule is I add 2 eggs to whatever the original recipe says. So in this case, the original recipe says 1 egg. So I will add 2 eggs to that 1 egg, which makes 3 eggs. Math, hello. So I would use those 3 eggs instead of just 1 egg if I was converting this recipe to a coconut flour recipe. The next thing I look at is how much and what type of other liquids or fats are being used in this recipe. Coconut flour is extremely absorbent, so your flour to liquid ratio is crucial in your baked goods because if you don't have it just right, you are either going to end up with a soppy mess or most likely a dry, dense blob in your mouth, and it's going to be gross. Now, as I had already mentioned in my previous video, I had the general rule is every 1 cup of coconut flour is 6 eggs plus 1 cup of liquid. And again, as I already said, I do not like that rule. So aside from increasing your eggs by 2, I also increased the fats or the liquids that are in the original recipe. But I don't automatically start out by just dumping 1 cup of liquid in there. I start out by using the same amount of liquid as I did coconut flour. So in this recipe, when we converted it to a coconut flour recipe, we used a 1/2 cup plus an 1/8 cup of coconut flour. So I would start out with a 1/2 cup plus an 1/8 cup of liquid if I was converting this recipe to a coconut flour recipe. In this case, the original recipe called for a 1/4 cup of butter and a 1/4 cup of shortening. I don't use shortening, so it would just be butter for me. So it's a total of a 1/2 cup of liquid. But again, if I was converting this to a coconut flour recipe, I would increase that to the amount of coconut flour I am using, which is a 1/2 cup plus 1/8 cup, or 16 tablespoons of butter in this particular case. So that would be my starting point. And in this particular recipe, the only other ingredient that's left is the vanilla extract. And as I already talked about, anything with added flavoring, you adjust according to your taste. So it's the same rule of thumb as with the seasonings or spices. I increase it by half or double. And the last thing I do is once all the ingredients has been added, everything's been combined, everything's been stirred up really well, I give the dough an extra 20 to 30 second stir, really good stir. This is a gluten-free flour, so you don't have to worry about over stirring it and making your baked goods tough. This just gives the coconut flour a chance to start absorbing any extra liquids there and for the binding agents to start working. Once you have given it that extra stir, the last thing I do is test the texture of the dough. Don't just say, oh yeah, okay, this looks good, so let's just start dumping it out and baking it. And the way I test this is I usually form the whole dough into a smooth ball and then massage it in my hands for a few seconds. Or if I'm making cookies, I scoop a tablespoon out and I kind of roll it around in my hand in a ball. If the dough comes together smoothly and you can make a nice, smooth, soft ball with the dough, then you know your dough is the right texture. If you're massaging it or trying to roll it and the shape's not coming together, it's crumbly, it's not holding its form at all, then you know that you need to add a little bit of an extra binding agent. Now at this point of the recipe, I do not add more eggs for the binding agent because, as I've already mentioned, I do not want my baked goods to taste like eggs. So at this point of the recipe, if I feel that my dough is not coming together and it feels crumbly and dry, I use an alternative binding agent that is mentioned in, as I already said, my article and video that talks about using egg substitutes with coconut flour. My go-to extra binding agent is xanthan gum and water. And if you want to know the exact measurements on that, again, you can check out that video on egg substitutes that work with coconut flour. If it's still not coming together, then add a little bit more moisture and add a little bit more binding agent and let it set for a little bit if it still seems like it's not coming together. Just keep doing that and testing your dough until it comes together and has that soft texture that you are wanting for your baked good dough. Once your dough is all stirred together and it's the right texture, it's nice and smooth, it's coming together, it's holding its shape, then all you need to do is shape and bake the recipe the same way that the original recipe says. You don't have to change the time, you don't have to change the temperature, you just shape it and bake it just like the original recipe says. Another thing is gluten-free baked goods do not bake up firm. So you do not want to try to bake your coconut flour recipes until they are firm. You want to bake them long enough until a tester comes out clean. The rest of the firming up will happen as they cool. So once the coconut flour baked good is baked, you remove it from the oven and you allow it to cool on the pan enough to firm up before you try to remove it. So that is the updated version on how you should use coconut flour in your baked goods and how you can easily convert a high-carb recipe or an almond flour recipe into a coconut flour recipe. I hope this was helpful to you. If it was, make sure you click the like button, click the subscribe button. You can leave me a comment if you want to. Let me know if there's any recipe or information that you'd like to learn more about, and I will do what I can to get that all out for you. And as always, keep cooking.